What if strange hairs appear in your food? It all started with a single strand of hair. Just one. I remember staring at it, nestled between the tines of my fork, contrasting starkly against the white of my plate. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, who hasn't found a stray hair in their food at least once in their life? I simply plucked it off, set it aside, and continued eating. But then it happened again. And again. And again. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. It became a constant, unwelcome companion to every meal. I live alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. It's not much, but it's mine, and I've always taken pride in keeping it clean and tidy. I'm not a neat freak by any means, but I do like things to be in order. So when I started finding hairs in my food with increasing frequency, it bothered me more than it probably should have. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't being careful enough when I cooked. Maybe I needed to tie my hair back more securely. But as time went on, I realized something wasn't adding up. The hairs I was finding weren't mine. They were longer, darker, and coarser than my own fine, blonde strands. I started to pay more attention to my food preparation. I'd tie my hair back tightly, even wear a hairnet sometimes. I'd inspect each ingredient carefully before using it, check my utensils, my cutting board, everything. But still, those dark hairs kept appearing. It was unsettling, to say the least. I found myself examining every bite before it entered my mouth, paranoia growing with each meal. The simple act of eating, once a pleasure, became a source of anxiety. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was coming from the groceries I bought. But I'd switched stores multiple times, and the problem persisted. I even started ordering prepackaged meals, thinking that would solve the issue. It didn't. If anything, it got worse. As the months dragged on, I became desperate. I reached out to friends, family, even online forums for advice. Everyone had their own theories and suggestions. My best friend, Sarah, suggested it might be a prank. Maybe someone at work is messing with you, she said. But that didn't explain the hairs in food I prepared at home. My brother thought it might be a pest problem. Could be rats or something, he offered. But an exterminator found nothing, and besides, rat hair looks nothing like what I was finding. Online, the theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some suggested it might be a rare medical condition causing me to hallucinate the hairs. Others were convinced it was a government conspiracy to contaminate the food supply. Neither explanation sat right with me. I tried every suggestion, no matter how outlandish. I changed my diet, going from omnivore to vegetarian to vegan and back again. The hairs persisted in every type of food. I deep cleaned my entire apartment, threw out all my cookware and bought new. Still, the hairs appeared. I installed air purifiers, thinking maybe the hairs were somehow floating in from outside. It made no difference. I even went as far as to set up cameras in my kitchen, hoping to catch whatever was causing this. But the footage showed nothing unusual, just me preparing meals and then, inexplicably, hairs appearing in the food. The constant stress began to take its toll. I lost weight, my skin took on a sallow complexion, and dark circles formed under my eyes. Sleep became elusive, my nights filled with anxious thoughts about what I would find in my next meal. My work started to suffer. I couldn't concentrate, constantly distracted by the gnawing fear in my stomach. My boss noticed, called me into his office one day to ask if everything was all right. I lied, said I was fine. How could I explain what was happening? I started avoiding social situations that involved food. No more dinners out with friends, no more family gatherings. I made excuses, claimed I was on a special diet or wasn't feeling well. The isolation only added to my stress. One particularly bad day, after finding a clump of hair in a sealed protein bar, I broke down and called my doctor. I poured out the whole story, expecting to be dismissed as crazy. To my surprise, she listened patiently and then suggested a series of tests. The next few weeks were a blur of medical appointments. Blood tests, allergy panels, psychological evaluations. They even did a CT scan of my head, looking for any abnormalities that might explain what I was experiencing. In the end, they found nothing. Every test came back normal. The doctor suggested it might be stress-induced hallucinations and recommended therapy and anti-anxiety medication. I tried the medication. It made me feel foggy and disconnected, but did nothing to stop the appearance of the hairs. If anything, it made me less vigilant, and I found myself accidentally ingesting hairs more often. Therapy was a dead end too. The therapist was kind and tried to be understanding, but I could tell she didn't really believe me. She kept trying to steer our conversations towards my childhood, my relationships, anything but the actual problem at hand. As the 1-year mark of this nightmare approached, I was at my wit's end. I had tried everything, consulted everyone, and still, every single meal was contaminated with those long, dark hairs. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe everyone was right, maybe it was all in my head. But every time I began to doubt myself, I'd find another hair, tangible proof that I wasn't imagining things. The stress and lack of proper nutrition were taking a serious toll on my health. I was pale, gaunt, my own hair starting to thin and fall out. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, losing my hair, while mysterious hairs invaded every aspect of my life. It was around this time that the dreams started. Vivid, unsettling dreams that left me more exhausted than when I went to sleep. In these dreams, I was always in my kitchen, preparing a meal. But something was off. The proportions were wrong, everything slightly too big or too small. And there, sitting at my table, was my mother. My mother had passed away years ago, long before this hair nightmare began. But in my dreams, she was young and vibrant, just as I remembered her from my childhood. She would smile at me, that warm, loving smile I missed so much. "Come, sit down," she'd say. "I made your favorite." And there, on the plate in front of her, would be a meal. My favorite childhood dish, perfectly prepared. But covering it, like a thick blanket, were long, dark hairs. My mother's hairs. In the dream, I'd watch in horror as she casually picked up her fork, twirled the hair-covered food around it, and brought it to her mouth. "It's good for you," she'd say, her mouth full of hair. "Eat up." I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the taste of hair in my mouth. These dreams became a regular occurrence, adding a new layer of torment to my already stressful life. I found myself dreading sleep almost as much as I dreaded eating. As the dreams continued, I started to wonder if there was a connection. Was my subconscious trying to tell me something? Was there some long-buried memory or trauma related to my mother that was manifesting in this bizarre way? I tried to recall any incidents from my childhood that might explain this. Had there been some event involving hair and food that I'd repressed? But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with anything. My mother had always been loving and attentive. She was an excellent cook, and some of my fondest memories were of us in the kitchen together, preparing meals. There was nothing sinister or traumatic about those memories. Still, the dreams persisted, becoming more vivid and disturbing with each passing night. In some, my mother would force-feed me the hair-covered food. In others, she would brush her long, dark hair over my plate, shedding copiously onto my meal. I began to dread going to sleep almost as much as I dreaded eating. My life had become a waking nightmare, with no respite even in sleep. As the second year of this ordeal began, I was a shell of my former self. I had lost my job due to poor performance and frequent absences. My friends had all but given up on me, tired of my constant cancellations and vague excuses. I rarely left my apartment anymore, spending my days in a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. I subsisted on liquid meal replacements, thinking that somehow liquids might be safe from the hair contamination. I was wrong. Even in sealed bottles of nutrition shakes, I'd find those familiar dark strands. My life had become a monotonous cycle of fear and disgust. Wake up from a nightmare, try to force down some food, spend hours picking hairs out of my teeth and throat, repeat. I couldn't remember the last time I'd enjoyed a meal, or even felt genuinely hungry. Food had become the enemy, a necessary evil that I had to face multiple times a day. I started to wonder how long I could go on like this. The human body is remarkably resilient, but surely there had to be a breaking point. How long could a person live in constant fear and revulsion? It was during one particularly bad night, after a dream where my mother had tried to braid her hair into my food, that I had a moment of clarity. Or perhaps it was a moment of madness. The line between the two had become increasingly blurred. I realized that I had been reacting to this situation for 2 years now. Always on the defensive, always trying to avoid or prevent the hairs from appearing. But what if that was the wrong approach? What if, instead of trying to escape this nightmare, I needed to confront it head-on? With trembling hands, I made my way to the kitchen. I pulled out a pot, filled it with water, and set it to boil. Then, I reached for a box of pasta, spaghetti, long and thin, not unlike the hairs that had been tormenting me. As the pasta cooked, I stood there, watching the steam rise, my heart pounding in my chest. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to willingly eat something that I knew would be contaminated? When the pasta was done, I drained it and put it on a plate. I didn't add any sauce or seasoning. I wanted to be able to see clearly what I was about to do. I sat down at my small kitchen table, the plate of pasta steaming in front of me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and when I opened them again, there they were. Long, dark hairs, intertwined with the pasta strands. For a long moment, I just stared at the plate. My stomach churned, my throat constricted. Every instinct screamed at me to throw the plate away, to run, to hide. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up my fork. With a hand that shook so badly I could barely control it, I twirled some of the hair-covered pasta around my fork. I brought it to my mouth, paused for a moment, then shoved it in before I could change my mind. The sensation was exactly as horrifying as I had imagined. I could feel the hairs on my tongue, sliding down my throat. I gagged, my eyes watering, but I forced myself to chew and swallow. And then, I took another bite. And another. I don't know how long I sat there, methodically eating that plate of hair-infested pasta. Time seemed to lose all meaning. All I knew was the repetitive motion of fork to plate to mouth, and the constant, nauseating feeling of hair in my mouth and throat. When the plate was finally empty, I sat back, exhausted and nauseous. I waited for something to happen. Some revelation, some change, some sign that this ordeal was finally over. But nothing changed. The world didn't end. I didn't suddenly wake up from this 2-year nightmare. I was still sitting in my kitchen, alone, with an empty plate in front of me and the taste of hair in my mouth. As the reality of what I had just done sank in, I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. What had I expected? That eating a plate full of hair would somehow solve everything? That it would make the hairs stop appearing? The laugh turned into a sob, and before I knew it, I was crying uncontrollably. All the fear, frustration, and hopelessness of the past 2 years came pouring out. I cried until I had no tears left, until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen. When the tears finally stopped, I felt different. Not better, exactly, but changed. It was as if by facing my fear head-on, by willingly doing the thing that terrified me most, I had crossed some kind of threshold. I stood up on shaky legs and made my way to the bathroom. I needed to brush my teeth, to get the taste of hair out of my mouth. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I hardly recognized the person staring back at me. Pale, gaunt, with dark circles under my eyes and limp, thinning hair. But there was something else too. A glint in my eye that hadn't been there before. A spark of determination? Defiance? I wasn't sure. As I brushed my teeth, spitting out strands of hair along with the toothpaste, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. And if eating the hair-infested food hadn't solved the problem, then I needed to find another way. I spent the rest of that night researching. Not about hair in food or possible contaminations, I had exhausted those avenues long ago. Instead, I looked into extreme situations, survival stories, accounts of people who had faced seemingly insurmountable challenges and come out the other side. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through my grimy windows, I had the beginnings of a plan. It was drastic, possibly even dangerous. But after 2 years of living in constant fear and disgust, I was willing to try anything. I was going to leave. Leave my apartment, leave my city, leave everything behind. I would go somewhere remote, somewhere I could control every aspect of my environment. Maybe then, I could figure out what was really going on. It took me a week to get everything in order. I sold or gave away most of my possessions, keeping only what I could fit in a backpack. I found a small, isolated cabin for rent in a remote part of the mountains, hundreds of miles from the nearest town. The day before I was set to leave, I had one last dream about my mother. But this time, it was different. We were in the kitchen, as always, but there was no food on the table. Instead, my mother was brushing her long, dark hair. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Sometimes, we have to leave to find our way back," she said, cryptically. I woke up feeling unsettled, but also strangely hopeful. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like I was taking control of my life again. As I locked the door to my apartment for the last time, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. I didn't know what awaited me in the mountains, or if this drastic move would solve anything. But I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't continue the way I had been. The journey to the cabin was long and tiring, but as I watched the city recede in my rearview mirror, I felt a sense of liberation. With each mile that passed, I was leaving behind the scene of my 2-year nightmare. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The cabin was small and rustic, just a single room with a bed, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom. But to me, it looked like paradise. I unpacked my meager belongings and took stock of my supplies. I had brought enough non-perishable food to last me a month, all carefully inspected and sealed. I also had a water filtration system, just in case. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. Maybe here, in this isolated place, I could finally get to the bottom of what was happening to me. The first week in the cabin passed uneventfully. I stuck to my pre-package. The first week in the cabin passed uneventfully. I stuck to my pre-packaged meals, carefully inspecting each one before eating. To my relief and surprise, I didn't find a single hair. I began to wonder if perhaps the change of environment had somehow broken the cycle. As the days went by, I felt my anxiety slowly start to ebb. The constant tension in my shoulders began to ease, and I found myself sleeping better than I had in months. The nightmares about my mother and hair-infested food became less frequent. By the second week, I felt brave enough to start preparing my own meals again. I had brought some basic ingredients with me, all carefully sealed and inspected before I left the city. With trembling hands, I made a simple meal of rice and beans. I sat down at the small table in the cabin, staring at the plate in front of me. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead. This was the moment of truth. Slowly, I picked up my fork and took a small bite. Nothing. No hair. Just the simple, clean taste of food. I burst into tears, overwhelmed by relief and a surge of emotions I couldn't even begin to name. For the first time in 2 years, I ate a meal without fear, without disgust. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. Over the next few weeks, I continued to prepare my own meals, gradually expanding my repertoire. Each meal was a small victory, a step towards reclaiming my life. I began to put on weight, and color returned to my cheeks. I even started to enjoy cooking again, something I had once loved but had lost in the nightmare of the past 2 years. As I approached the 1-month mark of my stay in the cabin, I realized I was facing a decision. My food supplies were running low, and I would need to make a trip to the nearest town to restock. The thought filled me with anxiety. What if leaving the cabin broke whatever spell had freed me from the hair nightmare? But I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. If I was ever going to reclaim my life fully, I would need to face the outside world again. So, with a mixture of determination and fear, I made the long drive into town. The small grocery store seemed enormous and overwhelming after a month in the cabin. I moved through the aisles slowly, carefully selecting items and inspecting each one before putting it in my cart. As I was checking out, the cashier, a friendly-looking older woman, struck up a conversation. "You must be staying up at the old Johnson cabin," she said. "We don't get many visitors out this way." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It was the first real interaction I'd had with another person in a month. The woman smiled kindly. Well, you picked a good time to visit. The diner down the street is having their annual pie festival this weekend. You should stop by if you have the chance. Best pies in the state. I thanked her politely, but inwardly, I was panicking. Eat at a diner? The thought was terrifying. But as I loaded my groceries into the car, I couldn't shake the idea. Maybe this was the next step. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that I could eat food prepared by others without falling back into the nightmare. Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself walking towards the diner. It was a quaint place, with red vinyl booths and a chrome counter. The smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air. I slid into a booth, my hands shaking as I picked up the menu. A waitress approached, her smile warm and welcoming. "What can I get for you, hon?" she asked. I swallowed hard. "I heard you have good pie," I managed to say. "Best in the state," she replied with a wink. "Apples are a specialty. Want a slice?" I nodded, and she bustled off to get my order. As I waited, I could feel my anxiety rising. What if there was hair in the pie? What if this brought everything crashing back? When the waitress returned with a generous slice of apple pie, I stared at it for a long moment. It looked delicious, golden brown crust and chunks of apple visible through the lattice top. But all I could think about was the possibility of finding a long, dark hair buried in the filling. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and picked up my fork. I could do this. I had to do this. The first bite was a revelation. The crust was buttery and flaky, the filling perfectly balanced between sweet and tart. And most importantly, there was no hair. I took another bite, and another. Before I knew it, I had finished the entire slice. As I paid my bill, I felt a sense of triumph. I had done it. I had eaten food prepared by strangers in a public place, and nothing bad had happened. It felt like a huge step forward. On the drive back to the cabin, I found myself smiling. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future. The hair nightmare that had consumed my life for so long seemed to be fading, like a bad dream in the light of day. Back at the cabin, I unpacked my groceries and prepared a simple dinner. As I ate, I thought about what my next steps should be. I couldn't stay in the cabin forever, as peaceful as it was. I needed to rebuild my life, to reconnect with the world I had withdrawn from. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I would stay at the cabin for one more month, to make sure that the hair problem was truly gone. And then, I would return to the city. Not to my old apartment with its bad memories, but to a new place, a fresh start. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I felt ready to face them. The nightmare was over. I was free. The next few weeks passed in a blur of normalcy that I had almost forgotten could exist. I continued to cook my own meals, each one a small celebration of my newfound freedom. I even started to experiment with new recipes, something I hadn't done in years. The simple joy of creating a meal without fear was intoxicating. I made a few more trips into town, each one easier than the last. I became a regular at the diner, trying a different pie each visit. The waitresses knew me by name now, and their friendly chatter was a balm to my long-isolated soul. As my planned departure date approached, I found myself feeling both excited and nervous about returning to the city. I had already started looking for apartments online, dreaming of a fresh start in a new place. The night before I was set to leave, I decided to treat myself to a special dinner. I had bought a nice cut of steak from the butcher in town, along with some fresh vegetables. As I prepared the meal, humming to myself, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in years. I sat down at the table, admiring my handiwork. The steak was perfectly cooked, the vegetables crisp and colorful. I poured myself a glass of wine, a small indulgence to celebrate my last night in the cabin. As I cut into the steak, savoring the first bite, I felt a sense of triumph. I had done it. I had overcome my fear, reclaimed my life. Tomorrow, I would return to the world, stronger and wiser for what I had been through. But as I chewed, I felt something strange. A texture that didn't belong. My heart began to race as I realized what it was. Slowly, reluctantly, I pulled a long, dark hair from my mouth. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. No. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when I was so close to putting it all behind me. With trembling hands, I cut into the steak again. There, embedded in the pink flesh, were more hairs. Long, dark, and unmistakable. I pushed away from the table so violently that my chair toppled over. I ran to the sink, spitting out what was in my mouth, gagging and retching. When I finally caught my breath, I turned back to look at the table. The steak sat there innocently, as if mocking me. I approached cautiously, as if it might attack. Upon closer inspection, I could see more hairs, not just in the steak but tangled in the vegetables as well. My mind raced. How was this possible? I had prepared everything myself. I had been so careful. The meat had been sealed, the vegetables washed thoroughly. There was no way this could be happening. Unless it had never stopped. Unless my time in the cabin, my newfound peace, had all been a delusion. A brief respite granted by my broken mind before plunging me back into the nightmare. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. As I looked up into the mirror, I froze. There, stuck to my wet cheek, was another long, dark hair. Panic seized me. I began to claw at my face, my neck, my arms, finding more hairs with every swipe. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tore off my clothes, horrified to find more hairs clinging to my skin. It was as if they were growing from me, or maybe growing into me. I couldn't tell anymore. In a frenzy, I turned on the shower, making the water as hot as I could stand. I stepped under the scalding spray, scrubbing at my skin until it was raw and red. But still, the hairs remained. As the steam filled the small bathroom, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the fogged-up mirror. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw someone else. A figure with long, dark hair, standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I sank to the floor of the shower, the water still pounding down on me. What was happening? Had I ever really escaped? Or had the nightmare simply been biding its time, waiting for me to lower my guard before striking again? As I sat there, shivering despite the hot water, a horrible thought occurred to me. What if there was no escape? What if this was my reality now, forever? The hairs, the constant fear, the inability to trust even my own senses? I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled in the shower. Eventually, the water ran cold, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. When I finally mustered the courage to step out of the shower, I avoided looking in the mirror. I couldn't bear to see what might be reflected there. I dried off mechanically, my movements stiff and robotic. As I walked back into the main room of the cabin, my eyes fell on my phone. It sat on the bedside table, innocent and ordinary. But to me, it represented a lifeline, a connection to the outside world. With shaking hands, I picked it up. Who could I call? Who would believe me? The doctors hadn't helped before. My friends and family had long since given up on me. I was alone in this, truly alone. As I stared at the phone, trying to decide what to do, a notification popped up. A text message. From an unknown number. My heart pounding, I opened it. The message contained only 4 words, "Welcome back. We missed you." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. And yet, as I looked around the cabin, at the half-eaten meal on the table, at the clothes strewn across the floor, at the wisps of steam still escaping from the bathroom, I knew that it was. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had only just begun. I stared at the phone on the floor, my mind reeling from the implications of that text message. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too confining. I needed air. Stumbling outside, I gulped in the cool night air. The forest around me, once a source of peace, now seemed menacing. Shadows danced between the trees, and every rustle of leaves made me flinch. As I stood there, trying to calm my racing heart, my phone buzzed again. Against my better judgment, I looked at the screen. "Check your email. Now." The message was curt, almost angry. It wasn't the soothing, creepy tone I'd expected from some supernatural entity. This felt human. And somehow, that was even more terrifying. With trembling hands, I opened my email app. There, at the top of my inbox, was a new message from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Your condition urgent." I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The email contained only a link and a short message. "You're not special. You're not the only one. Click the link. You have 10 minutes before we revoke access." The tone was brusque, impatient. This didn't feel like some elaborate prank or supernatural occurrence. It felt real, and that reality was more frightening than any ghost story. I clicked the link. It led me to a forum, hidden deep in the recesses of the internet. As I scrolled through the posts, my blood ran cold. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of people describing experiences just like mine. Hair in their food, appearing from nowhere. The isolation, the fear, the desperate attempts to find a solution. But it was the most recent post that caught my eye. It was titled "The Cabin Experiment Phase 2 Complete." With growing horror, I read the post. It detailed how a group had been selecting individuals who showed early signs of hair hallucinations. They would monitor these people, escalating their experiences, pushing them to the brink of sanity. And then, when the subjects were at their most vulnerable, they would be guided to isolated locations. Like my cabin. The post ended with a list of subject numbers and statuses. I saw my own address on the list, followed by the words "Phase 2 complete. Ready for extraction." My mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It explained too much, filled in too many gaps in my experience. As I continued to read, I learned more. This wasn't just some sick game. The people behind this believed they were studying a new kind of psychological phenomenon. They thought they were pushing the boundaries of human perception and reality. I was nothing more than a lab rat to them. My suffering, my fear, my gradual descent into madness, it was all data for their experiment. Anger began to replace my fear. How dare they? How dare they play with people's lives like this? I had lost everything: my job, my friends, my sense of security, all for their sick study. I scrolled to the bottom of the page, looking for some way to contact the administrators, to demand answers. Instead, I found another message, this one clearly meant for the subjects who had reached this point. Congratulations on making it this far. You've proven more resilient than most. But don't think this is over. It's only just beginning. Sweet dreams. The screen went black. I refreshed, tried to go back, but the form was gone. As if it had never existed. I stood there in the dark, the glow of my phone the only light, feeling more alone than ever. But now, that loneliness was tinged with a new emotion, rage. They thought this was the end? That I would just accept this and move on? No. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. I stormed back into the cabin, my mind racing. I needed to find out more about these people, this experiment. I needed to expose them, to stop them from doing this to anyone else. But as I reached for my laptop, I hesitated. What if this was just another part of their experiment? What if my anger, my desire for revenge, was exactly what they were counting on? I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. I didn't know what was real anymore. Every action, every thought, felt like it could be part of their sick game. As I sat there, paralyzed by indecision, I felt something brush against my arm. I looked down, already knowing what I would see. A long, dark hair, curled around my wrist like a bracelet. I stared at it, this tangible reminder of my torment. And in that moment, I made a decision. I didn't care if this was part of their plan or not. I didn't care if I was playing into their hands. I was going to fight back. I grabbed my laptop and began to work. I would find these people. I would expose their cruel experiment. And I would make sure they never did this to anyone ever again. As I typed furiously, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in years, I had a purpose. I had a goal. And nothing, not the hairs, not the fear, not the uncertainty of what was real and what wasn't, would stop me. Let them come. Let them try to break me further. I was done being a victim. From now on, I was a hunter. And they were my prey. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the cabin as I delved deeper into my investigation. Hours blended into days, and I lost track of time. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I couldn't stop. I had to find answers. As I dug deeper, I began to notice strange patterns. Posts disappearing moments after I read them. Links leading to dead ends. It was as if the information was alive, shifting and changing to elude my grasp. And then there were the hairs. They were everywhere now. In my food, my clothes, my bed. I found them tangled in my own hair when I showered, coarse and dark against my blonde strands. I started to wonder if they were growing from me, replacing my own hair strand by strand. One night, as I sat hunched over my laptop, I felt something brush against my arm. I looked down, expecting to see another hair. Instead, I saw a small, red bump. As I watched, horrified, the bump grew larger, splitting open like a grotesque flower. And from it emerged a single, long, dark hair. I scrambled away, knocking over my chair in my haste. My heart pounded as I examined the rest of my skin. More bumps were appearing, each one promising a new hair. I was changing, transforming into something else. In a panic, I grabbed my phone to call for help. But as I unlocked the screen, I saw a new message waiting for me. Interesting development. Continue as normal. Do not seek medical attention. The clinical tone of the message sent chills down my spine. They were watching me. They knew what was happening to me. And they wanted it to continue. I threw the phone across the room, watching as it shattered against the wall. But even as I did so, I knew it was futile. They would find other ways to reach me, to monitor me. As the days wore on, my grip on reality began to slip. The cabin seemed to shift around me, walls moving when I wasn't looking. Sometimes I would enter a room to find it completely different from how I remembered it. Once, I opened a closet to find it led to a long, dark corridor that I was sure hadn't been there before. I began to lose time. I would blink and find hours had passed. Sometimes I would come to awareness in different parts of the cabin, with no memory of how I got there or what I had been doing. The hairs continued to grow, longer and thicker. They sprouted from every surface in the cabin, hanging from the ceiling like a grotesque canopy, carpeting the floors. I couldn't escape them. They were in my food, in my water. I breathed them in with every breath. One night, I woke to find myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror. My reflection was barely recognizable. My once blonde hair had been completely replaced by the long, dark strands. They grew from my scalp, my face, even from the corners of my eyes. As I watched, they began to move of their own accord, writhing like snakes. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But as I looked down at my hands, I saw the hairs there too, growing from my palms, curling around my fingers. In that moment, I knew I had to escape. I had to get out of this cabin, away from whatever was happening to me. I ran for the door, only to find it wouldn't open. The windows were the same, unyielding no matter how hard I pounded on them. As panic set in, I heard a sound. A soft whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained to hear it, to understand the words. And then I realized it was coming from the hairs. They were speaking to me. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound. But I couldn't escape it. The whispers were inside me now, a part of me. And they were telling me things. Horrible things. Truths I didn't want to know. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the knowledge pouring into my mind. The true nature of the experiment. The others who had come before me. What had happened to them? What was going to happen to me? As the whispers grew louder, drowning out my own thoughts, I felt the last shreds of my sanity slipping away. I was becoming something else. Something that wasn't human anymore. In my last moments of clarity, I realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. There never had been. The experiment hadn't gone wrong. It had gone exactly as planned. As darkness closed in around me, the last thing I saw was my own hand, now completely covered in writhing, whispering hair. And I understood at last. I wasn't the subject of the experiment. I was the result. The whispers faded, leaving me in a deafening silence. I blinked, my vision clearing slowly. The writhing hairs that had covered everything moments ago were gone. The cabin looked normal. Ordinary. As if nothing had happened. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky and weak. How long had I been on the floor? Hours? Days? I couldn't tell. The windows showed darkness outside, but whether it was night or early morning, I couldn't say. I made my way to the bathroom, dreading what I might see in the mirror. But my reflection was just me. Tired, pale, with dark circles under my eyes, but undeniably human. My hair was its usual blonde, no sign of the dark, invasive strands that had seemed to consume me. Had it all been a hallucination? A vivid nightmare brought on by stress and isolation? But as I ran my fingers through my hair, I felt something. A single, long, dark hair tangled among my own. I pulled it out, holding it up to the light. It was real. Tangible. My phone lay on the floor where I had thrown it, the screen cracked but still functional. With trembling fingers, I unlocked it. There were no mysterious messages, no ominous warnings. Just a missed call from my mother and a text from a friend asking if I was okay. I opened my email, scrolling frantically for the message that had started it all. It wasn't there. The forum I had found, the posts about the experiment, I couldn't find any trace of them. Had I imagined it all? But the hair in my hand was real. The fear I had experienced was real. The months of finding hairs in my food before coming to this cabin that had been real, hadn't it? I sank onto the bed, my mind reeling. What was real and what wasn't? Had I uncovered a sinister experiment, or had my mind created an elaborate delusion to explain something it couldn't understand? The line between reality and fantasy blurred, leaving me stranded in a gray area of uncertainty. Part of me wanted to leave the cabin immediately, to run back to the safety of the familiar. But another part hesitated. What if leaving was exactly what they wanted? Or what if there was no they at all, and I was running from shadows created by my own mind? As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I sat there, turning the long, dark hair over and over in my fingers. I didn't have answers. I wasn't sure I ever would. But I knew one thing: whatever had happened, whatever was real or not, had changed me irrevocably. The world outside the cabin waited, filled with uncertainties. Whether those uncertainties were of my own making or the result of something beyond my understanding, I couldn't say. But I would have to face them, one way or another. With a deep breath, I stood up. It was time to leave the cabin. What awaited me outside, whether truth or delusion, I would have to discover for myself. I picked up my bag, took one last look around the cabin, and opened the door. The cool morning air hit my face, a stark reminder of the reality beyond these walls. As I stepped outside, I felt something brush against my cheek. I reached up, my heart pounding. It was just a leaf, carried on the breeze. I let out a shaky laugh, relief and uncertainty mingling in my chest. Whatever happened next, wherever this path led me, I was stepping into it with eyes wide open. Real or not, experiment or delusion, my journey was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning.